So the Toronto Star is a rather center-left newspaper based in Toronto. It's the main daily newspaper. The Toronto Star is everyone in Toronto knows it is very politically leaning to the left. During the G20, the Toronto Star started writing articles promoting the people arrested for the violence as heroes. One of my favorite moments, they had a picture of them all sitting together looking all lovable and wonderful. And the writers in the Toronto Star, even after the G20, still promoted the G20 anarchists as heroes. One of my favorite stories, which actually started a war with myself and a writer for the Toronto Star, Antonia Zabaisis, she wrote that one of the G20 criminals who was in prison at the time, unrepentantly for smashing up the city and encouraging and training young people to de-arrest fellow activists. The Toronto Star writer Zabaisis presented her as a hero for her prison activism, for saying that someone in a wheelchair couldn't get up to the second level to visit their friend inside the cell block. And you look at another writer for the Toronto Star, they wrote about Alex Hundred. Alex Hundred was the main ringleader behind the violence at the G20. He was one of the trainers who was arrested and later given 18 months in prison. His first week in jail, he notices you can't get a library book at the Toronto West Detention Centre. So the Toronto Star writes a story saying Alex Hundred is campaigning for the rights of his fellow prisoners to have library books. It's great that Alex Hundred is campaigning for library books. Should prisoners have books? Absolutely. But the Toronto Star, what they were doing is they're repositioning him. They're making him as a hero activist. They didn't criticize these people. They criticized the police, which was rightful, because what the police did on the 26th, after the violence, was reprehensible. Mass arrests was absolutely wrong. The reality was that the police walked into the trap. The police did exactly what they're expected to do. The day after people smash up the windows, they go back too hard. The same thing happened in Seattle, in the WTO. The police first didn't react, and then windows got smashed. Then the police reacted too hard, and the police lost face. And it's all a massive game. So the Toronto Star is one piece of media that's very pro towards the anarchists, and particularly when it comes to violence. But when you look at supporting activist causes and not reporting honestly, I can't help but think of the Vancouver Observer. The Vancouver Observer is one of my other favorite subjects. They were founded by Linda Solomon. Linda Solomon is an American who comes from Tennessee, and she comes from a family who's extremely influential. Her father was the head under Jimmy Carter. He was the head of I can't remember which government. So her father was very well connected in politics. She shows pictures of her with great American politicians, and she moved up to Canada. Her brother was already in Canada, Joe Solomon. Her brother leads Tides Canada. Linda comes up here and starts a blog, basically, with a few writers. She doesn't pay them, they're volunteers, and called the Vancouver Observer. If you read the Vancouver Observer, it's like the Inquirer of the environmental movement, because the stories they're telling are very bent. They're not telling the truth always. They're trying to make things look worse than they are. If you wonder why the Vancouver Observer is so absolutely out of this world in their reporting, is because when Linda arrived in Canada, she published a book, and it said, "Why I Love Vancouver." It was a way of getting the love from the city. And it said, written by a Pulitzer-nominated writer. Linda Solomon was not a Pulitzer nominee. Linda Solomon had someone send $50 in an envelope and a letter that says what she was involved in should be nominated for a Pulitzer. But according to the Pulitzer Foundation, you're not a Pulitzer nominee unless you're one of the 3 finalists. So the Vancouver Observer itself is founded on lies, absolutely. Linda Solomon's also a Hollyhocker, so she spends a lot of time at Hollyhock teaching and working there. Her husband, or her brother, owns a house next to Hollyhock. The mayor of Vancouver owns a house next to Hollyhock. And so the Observer itself is very much embedded, and the stories I see in the Observer are absolutely bent. I'll share one more, which I'm working on right now, which was the BC Civil Liberties Association is making a complaint against CSIS, saying that they spy on innocent activists. The story was broken by the Vancouver Observer. I read it first and I thought it seemed questionable, but I didn't have the evidence. Then someone I know who was very friendly got a copy of the Freedom of Information request that the Observer got for the story they wrote. They sent it to me because my name was on it, because they referenced one of my stories. But the basis of the Observer story, which became what the BC Civil Liberties Association is now pursuing against the government, was that the government is spying on innocent, regular, non-violent protesters. And they listed some of the organizations involved, the Dogwood Foundation and Council of Canadians and a few others. And it sounded innocent on the surface, but when we jump back to the Council of Canadians, to the Quebec Summit of the Americas, the head of the Council of Canadians, Maud Barlow, said smashing windows is an okay thing, sometimes necessary for democracy. But even more important were the other names of organizations on this piece of paper that the Observer presented as being innocent. Known as illegal, which takes us back to Harsha Walia and Harjab Grul and the people who were at the front of the line at the G20 and openly promote violence. And another of other very questionable organizations. But when the Observer writes a story on this issue, they say, oh, they're spying on the good people, and don't mention the bad people named underneath. So there's a lot of problems there. CBC. I find it disturbing a lot of people say, oh, all the CBC is this. And the CBC gets it from both sides. I see the people on the right going CBC is corrupt. I people on the left going CBC is corrupt because they're not doing our story enough. But it's not the whole CBC. There are people on the left and right on both. But some reporters in the CBC, I noticed one in Hamilton, he was doing stories on the Line 9 occupation in Westover last summer. His first story was just about Westover occupation. His next story had nothing to do with the Westover occupation, but it said, local activists are worried about the police being too heavy-handed and violent with activists. He didn't even mention the fact that a bunch of anarchists are occupying an explosive pipeline. But he also put Lee Reed in the article and didn't mention that Lee Reed, he was an anarchist rapper who was involved in the group, didn't mention that Lee Reed was part of the protest. So you see these strange propagandist stories of trying to get the people of Hamilton to think that the police could be violent, so that when the police make their arrests, and the anarchists ultimately are very well trained, many of these people, how to make their arrest look like they're being violated. There's something you should look up, both of you guys, if you want to see it. It's Sakura Saunders being arrested. I think if you type Sakura Saunders arrested in YouTube, you'll find it. And it's her in front of the convention center, and the police, okay, you have to leave now, and she wouldn't, so they take her to the police car. And then she starts fighting and dragging her body and screaming like she's being raped. But as part of the training, when you go to Ruckus Society training, they teach you how to get arrested. And they teach you how to make it look as absolutely bad on the police as possible. And they teach you how to do tricks to prepare yourself for when you get arrested. The other story that came out in the Hamilton Spectator was about an Indigenous guy who had his headdress taken off, his headdress taken off when he was arrested. How could they do that? That was so awful, to take off his headdress. Someone said this to me recently, a couple weeks ago, which is, the majority of people who join the media, who become journalists, do it for a reason, that they're activists. So when you look at the media, you have to assume almost all the people writing are writing, well, everyone writing is writing from some personal perspective. But many people who joined journalism career did this specifically so that they could create change. So You can call it corruption in journalism, that there are journalists from the CBC who are writing scare stories about the Hamilton police before arrests, or you could call it just part of what their job is, what they feel it is. I guess the question is, how do their media outlets track them, and how do their media outlets ensure that they're not pushing propaganda? That doesn't happen sometimes. CBC is particularly bad for that.